Welcome to Introduction to Jewish Philosophy. What is classic rabbinical thought? And who needs it all together? In order for us to get a handle on this subject, we're going to need to sweat out a lot of work along the way. And maybe before we even start, we should express a debt of gratitude, ironically, to the Greek philosophers. Among the most important lessons they taught is the importance of having clear definitions. Because if you don't have a clear definition, if you haven't rigorously defined what you're talking about, you're not really talking about anything. So, inevitably, in the series that begins here, we're going to need to tackle three distinct units. Unit number one, what is philosophy? And unit number one has a second component to it. Who needs philosophy? Then there's unit number two. What is Jewish philosophy? And it too has a second component. Who needs Jewish philosophy? Finally, unit three. What is classic rabbinic thought? What do we mean by that expression? And of course, inevitably, here too, the second component. Who needs it altogether? So let's get started with unit one. What is philosophy? I like to begin my answer to this question with a fairly cliched old story about the yeshiva student who is about to embark upon his first shidduch date. And he's terrified. So the first time he's going to have to be speaking to a member of the opposite sex. So he asks his older buddy, what am I supposed to talk about? And the buddy says, not to worry, there are three guaranteed safe subjects. Family, hobbies, and philosophy. So there he is, sitting on his first date. Family. Do you have a brother? No. Forget about family. Hobbies. Do you collect stamps? No. Forget about family. Forget about hobbies. Philosophy. If you had a brother, would he collect stamps? So let me state this at the outset loudly and clearly. That is not philosophy. So what is philosophy? We have here on the screen a dictionary definition. It's a dictionary definition that comes from the American Heritage Dictionary, and I'm going to focus in particular upon definition 1B, because I think it may be the most rigorous definition we've got. The investigation of causes and laws underlying reality. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, we're going to have to define what we mean by reality. Let's hold off on that for a moment, because there's a more basic observation that I need to stress here. And that is that philosophy is not the investigation of reality. It's not data gathering. It is not amassing a body of information. It's something more. It's something that can only begin once you've already done that. You have the data. The information is amassed. But now you need to do something more. Investigating the causes and laws underlying reality. What does that demand? Well, maybe a good way of getting a handle on this is by distinguishing between what I'll describe as the mechanistic what and the causative, interpretive why. The mechanistic what is, what am I seeing? And it is crucial for us to appreciate that the answer to that question will never include the philosophy. Because what I see is the data itself, the information. just after that mechanistic what comes that second question, the causative or interpretive why. What does it mean? And note well, the answer to the second question will never be grounded in what I've actually observed. The moment that I observe it, it's part of the mechanistic what. The interpretation is something that is perforce unseen. It's what underlies. It's something that you're imposing on what would otherwise remain a baffling mass of information, disorganized. The philosophy is taking that set of givens, that information, and imposing upon it a system, a methodology, a structure, in order to be able to understand it. To put it in very basic, concrete terms, you're standing here gazing out on the world, and next to you is Pooch, your pet dog. What's the difference between the way you see reality and the way Pooch does? When it comes to the mechanistic what, not much. There might be a difference in the acuity of color vision, but the bottom line is essentially what you see and what Pooch sees are the same thing. Except that, as far as we can tell, the only implicit question that Pooch addresses in his worldview is the mechanistic what. Whereas you inevitably ask that additional question. What does it mean? Again, the causative or interpretive why. And that's when you start doing philosophy. Because, again, the givens aren't the philosophy. It's the interpretation. Again, systematizing, imposing methodology, structuring. All of that, taking the set of givens and making that set of givens meaningful in a holistic sense, that's philosophy. And, of course, by having noted that essential definition of philosophy, we can already address the second component. So who needs philosophy? Maybe a more basic question. Who does philosophy? Who does philosophy? Any conscious human being does philosophy. We never are satisfied merely with making the observation without additionally asking, what's the interpretation? What does it mean? To be a functional human being necessitates doing philosophy. It necessitates making sense of the world in which we're functioning. If we're not doing that, we're not functioning at all. And of course, it's at this stage that we should append to this working definition something of a handle on what we mean by reality in the first place. And my answer very simply is reality. Reality can be defined in the context of whatever philosophy we're doing. That is, if we're discussing a philosophy of science, then inevitably the reality with which we're grappling is the way we observe natural phenomena taking place in the world. The way we devise mechanisms for studying these natural phenomena. All of that is going to be part of the set of givens, the reality upon which we operate in doing philosophy of science. If we were considering political philosophy, we would need to consider the structure of human society, how people organize themselves in such a society, how they establish a system of governance over groups of people. All of those would be relevant questions with respect to political philosophy. And so it goes. Every philosophy addresses some set of givens and imposes upon it that process, again, of systematization, methodology, structure, to make it meaningful and graspable by us. Taking that as a working definition of what philosophy is and who needs philosophy, we move on to the second unit. The second unit is going to take us a lot more time. What is Jewish philosophy? Well, If we take the definition of philosophy generally as the investigation of causes and laws underlying reality, let's just appropriate that for Jewish philosophy, which is going to have to describe what reality is in a somewhat more complex manner. Obviously, a Jewish philosophy addresses the realities that a general philosophy addresses as well, except if we consider reality to be a set of givens. If it's a Jewish philosophy, of course we're going to need to ask ourselves, well, what, from the perspective of Judaism, is given? So what is given in Judaism besides the givens that would pertain to a general philosophy? There's an obvious answer to this question. I think it's important for us to put it front and center on the table. What is given is the Torah. That, precisely, is what defines Judaism. We're not going to allow a vacuous statement like believing in God to serve as the characterization of the givens, because that manifestly applies to other systems as well. What defines Judaism is fidelity to the Torah and regarding the Torah as given. Now, of course, you could well argue you haven't defined Torah yet, which is an appropriate challenge, and I must admit, I'm not really going to be addressing it. I'm skirting that issue simply because defining rigorously what we mean by Torah would take us so far afield, we wouldn't be able to address the question of what a Jewish philosophy is. But on the premise that we can describe some corpus, if you will, written Torah, oral Torah, that we describe as the given of Judaism, then a Jewish philosophy is the investigation of the causes and laws underlying that, which inevitably forces us to consider an alternative definition, and I think it's important for us to put it front and center on the screen. The entry on Jewish philosophy in the classic Encyclopedia Judaica of half a century ago begins with the definition provided by Professor Arthur Hyman. Starts out well enough. Jewish philosophy may be described as the exploitation of Jewish beliefs and practices by means of general philosophic concepts and norms. So far, so good. Hence, it must be seen as an outgrowth of the biblical and rabbinic traditions on which Judaism rests, as well as part of the history of philosophy at large. In other words, there's both the aspect here that pertains to general philosophical enterprise and the additional set of givens that pertains to Judaism, again, the biblical and rabbinical traditions on which Judaism rests. But the definition continues. This description must, however, be expanded to include the general philosophic literature in Hebrew produced by Jews in the latter part of the Middle Ages. And I ask, must it? When we speak of the general philosophic literature in Hebrew produced by Jews, arguably we're speaking of philosophies enunciated by Jews, but does that make it a Jewish philosophy? If it isn't predicated upon the givens of Judaism, I humbly posit it is not a Jewish philosophy. And there's a great deal of work that Jews can be doing in general philosophy, but that in itself doesn't make it Jewish. All the more so when you consider the continuation of this definition and the various secular philosophies of Jewish existence formulated by modern Jewish thinkers. That's Jewish philosophy? Is the fact that Jews were the thinkers involved adequate to define something as a Jewish philosophy? Well, if we're going to speak of various secular philosophies that are enunciated by Jews, will we consider Marxism a Jewish philosophy? Karl Marx was Jewish. Will we consider Christianity a component of Jewish philosophy? After all the founders of Christianity were Jewish. If we're not going to include anything that pertains to Jews as a Jewish philosophy, inevitably, we're going to need to consider whether the givens that underlie that philosophy are the givens of Judaism. If they are not, we aren't speaking of Jewish philosophy. Now, I think it's important for us to consider a kind of sub-question on the margins here, and that is, well, what if someone questions the givens of Judaism? One questions belief in the Torah, one questions the need for fidelity to the system that the Torah ordains. In my humble opinion, while it may be perfectly legitimate to question those aspects, and for some it may even be an imperative, once you question the set of givens, you're in a different domain. It can be a legitimate domain of general philosophy. It can be legitimate before you get to Jewish philosophy, on some plane as a prerequisite of Jewish philosophy, to ask those questions. But when you're doing Jewish philosophy, you need to presume the set of givens that defines Judaism. Because if, for example, you conjure up a philosophy that purports to be a Jewish philosophy, but it rejects fidelity to some component of the Torah, to one of the commandments of the Torah, I'm sorry, but I'm going to tell you, you've crossed the line. That's not a Jewish philosophy anymore. It may be a philosophy by a Jew. It may be a philosophy that contemplates some of the givens of Judaism, but it can only be a Jewish philosophy if it is predicated upon the givens of Judaism. So this is a critical starting point in our considering what we mean by Jewish philosophy, but there's an additional dimension that we need, without any further ado, to bring to play here. And that is something that inevitably brings us back to the American Heritage Dictionary definition of philosophy. It's number 10 in the list of definitions, but I think on some intuitive plane we sense it is essential. It's integral in what we mean when we invoke the word philosophy. Definition 10, the system of values by which one lives. We expect a philosophy to have some practical consequence in terms of how we're going to live, don't we? And here's the problem. When we consider what the Torah is, again, taking as our presumptive starting point, then when we speak of the givens of Judaism, we're speaking of the Torah which is given. Well, what is the Torah? What does Torah mean? I'm sure all of you know very well what the correct meaning of the word Torah is, even though it is so frequently mistranslated as law. There are a lot of words in Hebrew that mean law, and Torah is not one of them. Torah means instruction, teaching. What is it teaching? What is the Torah teaching? More than anything else, the Torah is teaching a way of life. It's teaching us how to live. And here's the problem. If we expect that a philosophy, as a philosophy, is going to provide us with a system of values by which one lives, we don't need that in Judaism. We already know the system of values by which one lives. One lives by the mitzvot, the commandments that are ordained in the Torah. Isn't that it? So to that extent, we already have a problem at the outset in our definition of Jewish philosophy, and in some sense, while this problem will clearly impact on the second component, which is who needs Jewish philosophy, because we seem to be reaching the conclusion that no one does, I think it's more integral to understanding what we even mean when we speak of Jewish philosophy. And when we speak of the givens of Judaism that the philosophy is addressing. If the Torah is already providing us with the way of life, it's already providing us with how one lives, then what's the philosophy going to be? And inevitably there are a number of levels at which we're going to need to address this question. The first, let's consider Is everything in the Torah a practical imperative that tells us how to live? I think not. Where's the first place in the Torah that we encounter a statement that cannot be construed to be a practical imperative? It's really a trick question. It's the first verse of the Torah. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's not a practical imperative by any means, is it? You say, maybe it is. Or at least, that's what we expect it to be. After all, Rashi's famous comment on the first verse, appropriating actually an amalgam of two different midrashim, the question of Rabbi Yitzchak, the Torah didn't need to begin here. It needed to begin only from HaChodesh Hazel Lachem. This month is the first of the months of the year, which is the first mitzvah that was given collectively to the people of Israel. In other words, what underlies the question of Rabbi Yitzchak that Rashi is citing here? Arguably, precisely this premise. The Torah is all about what to do. And indeed, we should note that in the progression of the super commentaries on Rashi's commentary, that's precisely the manner in which they understand what Rashi is saying. The Mizrahi, Ikara Torah eina el mitzvotah. The essence of the Torah is the mitzvot. As Maharal expresses it, the very fact that Torah is Lashon Hora'ah, instruction, comes to tell us that it should only include mitzvot. Likewise, the Siftei Chachamim, that the Torah was given to Israel only for the sake of the mitzvot that are written in it. In other words, on some plane, indeed, the presumption that it's all on practical plane. Yes, but this is a question. Remember, the bottom line is that the Torah does begin with the story of creation. And what is that coming to teach you? The answer from the Midrash that Rashi cites is it's coming to provide the basis for our title deed to the land of Israel. And what's the significance of that? Let's carry this thread one step further. An idea that is expressed by Maharal in his commentary on Rashi's answer, that the reason that it is so important for the Torah to begin with the story of creation in order to establish our right of ownership over Eretz Yisrael also has practical ramifications. That is, as Maharal notes in his commentary, inasmuch as most of the mitzvot of the Torah pertain to the land, he notes various examples, and not only do most of them pertain to the land, but ultimately an essential principle that is articulated by Ramban in his Torah commentary is that all of the mitzvot of the Torah are essentially mishpat elokei haaretz, the laws of the God of the land. So to that extent then, we only really connect with the mitzvot by virtue of our connection with the land. And inasmuch as that's the case, Rashi's answer is also going to pertain to this inexorable bottom line of practice in terms of living according to the Torah, specifically in the land of Israel, and establishing our connection with the land of Israel as that basis. So, considering where this has left us, is this further strengthening the question that the Torah seems to preclude any non-halachic statements altogether? My response is partially yes, but predominantly no. The bottom line may be practical, but it doesn't change the fact that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is not a halachic statement. It's not a practical imperative. Call it a theological statement, a philosophical statement. It certainly is not a practical statement. In other words, On the contrary, it is precisely by dint of the non-halachic, non-practical statement that we reach the ramifications with respect to a way of life. Well, remember definition number 10, the system of values by which one lives? In other words, to the extent that it is precisely the non-halachic statement, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that enables us to actualize the practical imperatives of the Torah by understanding the bond to the land of Israel, the system of values by which one lives. The philosophical statement informs the practical bottom line. So when we consider this example of the opening verse of the Torah, if anything, it very much illustrates the principle. You need to be able to subject those aspects of the Torah that are not practical imperatives to the philosophical rigor of understanding what are they teaching us, in order to know at the end of the day, how indeed are you going to live? Now, this of course is just one example. Let's consider another example. We note Sefer HaChinuch, an anonymous work because the author in his humility did not sign it, but we realize it comes from late 13th, early 14th century. Sefer HaChinuch, a compendium of all of the mitzvot, winnows down the list to the most essential components, and what is particularly germane for our purposes is the list that he gives us of mitzvot that are perpetually incumbent upon us. And that list, he tells us, comprises 6 mitzvot. Leha'amin b'Hashem, shelo leha'amin zulato, li'achado, le'ahava oto, li'ir'a oto. First 5, to believe in God, not to believe in anything other than God, to unify Him, to love Him, to revere Him. The 6th, shelo latur achar machashevet halev v'riyat ha'inayim, to not wander after the thoughts of one's heart and the sight of one's eyes, is on something of a different plane. But if we ask ourselves, of these 6 perpetual mitzvot, how many of them are predicated upon philosophical undergirdings? I'd have to say at least 5. Maybe the 6th is also to some degree, but I could hear the argument that the 6th doesn't really require any philosophical undergirding. Certainly the first 5 do. A basis in philosophy, a basis in theology. You cannot enunciate what believing in God, not believing in anything else, unifying God, loving God, revering God mean without placing those principles in some philosophical context. They are, if you will, the undergirding for being able to fulfill these commandments. And it is particularly important for us to consider in this vein an idea that is articulated by Rambam in the first unit of the guide in chapter 50, which is especially germane here. States Rambam, and for purposes of saving time, I'm going to cite Rambam's statement from the translation into English of Shlomo Pines, the University of Chicago Press edition, at the beginning of chapter 50. Know you who studies this, my treatise, that belief is not the notion that is uttered, but the notion that is represented in the soul, when it has been averred of it that it is in fact just as it has been represented. I need to stress here that Rambam is not speaking here of belief in the sense of faith in something, but belief that something is a true statement. If you don't know what you're talking about, You can't talk about belief. If you belong to those who are satisfied with expressing in speech the opinions that are correct or that you deem to be correct without representing them to yourself and believing them, and still less without seeking certain knowledge regarding them, you take a very easy road. In accordance with this, you will find many stupid people holding to beliefs to which in their representation they do not attach any meaning whatever. God forbid that when we speak of believing in God, we should be in that category. We need to understand what we're talking about. We're not going to understand what we're talking about if we haven't, indeed, engaged in the philosophical enterprise of understanding just what these mitzvot entail. It is particularly fascinating to note that in the Barcelona disputation, the very end of the disputation, which takes place in the main synagogue in Barcelona on Shabbat Nachamu, 1263, immediately after the disputation, is, from my perspective, transparently predicated upon what Rambam just enunciated. That is, the underlying context, as Ramban records it, is King James of Aragon with his clerical entourage came into the synagogue Shabbat morning to preach about adopting Christian beliefs, and Ramban courageously stood up to them, and in particular, on the subject of the Trinity, Ramban goes to great lengths to explain how it is predicated upon, as Ramban expresses it, ta'ut gemura, a complete error, whereupon Ramban's principal antagonist, the Mishumad Pablo Cristiani, gets up, as Ramban records it, and affirms, undoubtedly with great fanfare, that he believes in complete unity. He is an uncompromising monotheist, and nonetheless, there is a Trinity. And it, he states, is an exceedingly deep manner that even the ministering angels don't understand. Whereupon Ramban immediately rebuts, since it is clear that a person cannot believe what he does not know, what he doesn't understand, evidently the angels also don't believe in the Trinity. And the bottom line, the end of the story, Ushtaku Chavirav, his colleagues shut him up because he was just making a fool out of himself. And Ramban manifestly emerges with the upper hand, and again we should note, Ramban clearly is basing himself upon this principle that is enunciated by Rambam. We need to know what we're talking about, which kind of brings us back to our starting point in rigorous definitions. But here we're not talking about rigorous definitions of philosophy. We're simply talking about recognizing that if we're going to be able to fulfill our obligations with respect to the Torah, first thing we need to know is what we're talking about. And that is going to require a level of philosophical sophistication. So, even to the extent that we appreciate that the Torah is about practical imperatives, that's not going to let us off the hook. We still need a philosophy in order to understand how we are to fulfill those practical imperatives as well. That gives us at least a starting point. But as we will yet see, it's just a starting point, because in considering how to live by the Torah, there's a much, much broader canvas that we need to paint. On that note, Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll continue next time.